The lack of a proper British tank doctrine in the interwar period directly dictates the order of battle for Operation Crusader. Somehow, this was the first major British victory against the Germans in World War II on land, and it was the first time the British used a full army in North Africa. In the aftermath of Operation Battleaxe, Wavell was gone, the Western Desert Force was renamed, and a new, more formal structure was given to British forces. Today, we're going to explore that structure and find out why the British went into battle with a lopsided force. This is the British Order of Battle for Operation Crusader. We'll start at the theatre level with Commander-in-Chief Sir Claude Auchinleck's Middle East Command. The command centre itself was located at Cairo, Egypt. However, Auchinleck finds himself practically running Crusader after the first week. So this isn't some out-of-touch general hundreds of miles behind the lines. Auchinleck is a central character. He spends the pre-battle period fighting against Churchill, who's constantly asking him to attack. He's the one who comes up with the concept for the Crusader plan, and he's also at 8th Army HQ after the first week of battle, making several big decisions that directly impact the course of the battle. Auchinleck has plenty of experience fighting in the First World War, and he had led the operation in Norway in 1940, but wasn't blamed for the failure because it was doomed to fail anyway. Prior to his appointment to the Middle East on the 2nd of July 1941, he had been Commander-in-Chief in India, intervening decisively in Iraq in early 1941 to help Wavell out. However, Auchinleck was an Indian Army officer, not a British officer, which meant he didn't know many of the generals that he was commanding in the Middle East. This leads him to make several bad decisions, such as appointing generals who were really not up to the task. He wasn't a tank man, as the Indian Army at the time didn't actually have any tanks. Since Crusader was designed to be a tank battle, the British were effectively being led by a general who didn't understand tank warfare. However, he wasn't the only one. In charge of the newly established 8th Army was Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham. This was the hero of the East African campaign, where Cunningham had decisively defeated the Italians with just 4 brigades of infantry under his command. And while his victory was swift, and his fame eclipsing O'Connor's more impressive victory over the Italians during Operation Compass, Cunningham was also completely out of his depth. During Crusader, he commanded an entire army with 2 corps and tanks. Just like Auchinleck, Cunningham had never commanded tanks before and knew very little about modern technology, including the radio. In fact, he was the one who decided to organise the army the way it ended up being, with the tanks separate to the infantry element. He was also irritable and showed signs of stress prior to the battle. He was the one who decided which version of the Crusader plan he wanted to execute, and that this version of the plan would engage the Germans in a decisive tank battle. So, this is a guy who didn't know anything about radios and tanks leading his army into a tank battle. Therefore, 8th Army was split into 2 corps, and the tank element of that army was the newly formed 30th Corps, led by Lieutenant General Norrie. This was the same 30th Corps which ended up going through the war and taking part in the Sicilian Campaign, the Normandy Campaign, and Operation Market Garden. It didn't have the rampant boar insignia yet, but I've decided to use it anyway to make it stand out from the other units. Its first commander was actually Lieutenant General Vivian Pope, a British Army officer who had developed several ideas about tanks before the war. Unfortunately, he was also killed in an air crash in early 1941. This meant that Norrie took over barely a month before Crusader began, and Norrie was actually more of a cavalry guy. Norrie was the man in charge of 1st Armoured Division in England, but didn't have a lot of experience commanding tanks and had no experience fighting in the desert. By the way, this was the same Norrie who would become Governor of Southern Australia and later the 8th Governor General of New Zealand. The main thing to know about Norrie, except the fact that I don't have a good relevant portrait of him for the unit card, is that he was very critical of elements of the Crusader plan laid out by Cunningham. He cast so many doubts on the plan that Cunningham decided to accompany Norrie into the battle just in case some of the flaws proved out to be true. And spoiler alert, yeah, they turned out to be right. 30 Corps had 2 divisions and 2 independent brigades under Norrie's command. The 1st Division was Gott's 7th Armoured Division. Major General William Gott went by the nickname Strafe, and in previous videos I've been calling him Strafe, but it's not. It's actually pronounced Strafe after the German phrase Gott strafe England, God save England. Prior to Crusader, Strafe Gott had commanded 7th Armoured Division's support group, a mostly artillery unit which we'll get to, taking part in Operation Compass, Operation Brevity, which he did command, and Battle Axe. Therefore, Gott was an artilleryman experienced in taking on German tanks with artillery. So, you'd think he'd put 2 and 2 together and have some idea on how to tackle German tanks in the most effective way, with artillery. But no, this is probably the one guy who should have realised that tanks should not take on tanks, which is what Rommel and other German commanders on the Eastern Front had already concluded. And that the best way for the British, especially, to take out German panzers was with their anti-tank and artillery guns, especially their 25-pounder artillery pieces, which Gott had been in command of. And this is the problem we got. If you want to know why the British couldn't beat the Germans in the desert for the first period of the war, Gott is the central character you need to study. Some people love him, and some people hate him. Either way, this guy is a mediocre commander who gets promoted over and over again after failing over and over again, without really ever grasping the tactical aspects needed to win this war. And he was now in charge of 7th Armoured Division going into Operation Crusader, which was a tank battle. 7th Armoured Division has 3 brigades and 3 regiments under its command. The first is Brigadier Davies' 7th Armoured Brigade. The brigade consists of 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, 6th Royal Tank Regiment and the 7th Queen's Own Hussars Tank Regiment. These are all equipped with various types of British cruiser tanks, but mostly A13 Covenanter tanks and A15 Crusader tanks. Also as part of Davies' brigade was the 4th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, -1 battery, 4th Battery of the 1st Light Anti-Aircraft Battalion, 3rd Troop of the 102nd Northumberland Hussars Anti-Tank Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, and A Company of 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade. Starting with 141 tanks, 7th Armoured Brigade would be battered during Operation Crusader and actually withdrew into Egypt late in November, having given its remaining tanks, perhaps as few as 10, to the other 2 brigades. The 2nd Brigade of 7th Armoured Division was Brigadier Scott Cockburn's 22nd Armoured Brigade. This brigade was actually from 1st Armoured Division, Norrie's former division, which had been asked to join the Crusader offensive, but hadn't actually arrived from the British Isles when the operation got underway. This is why 22nd Armoured Brigade has a different logo, although in this case the logo is actually 22nd Armoured Brigade's own logo, rather than 1st Armoured Division's, which was a charging rhino. This unit has 3 Yeomanry regiments armed with 155 Crusader tanks. It consisted of 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Horse Hussars Tank Regiment, 3rd County of London Yeomanry Tank Regiment, 4th County of London Yeomanry Tank Regiment, C Battery of the 4th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 2nd Troop of the 102nd Hussars Anti-Tank Regiment, B Company of the 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, 3rd Battery of the 1st Light Anti-Aircraft Battalion, and M Battery of 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment. 22nd Armoured Brigade was the only armoured brigade from 7th Armoured Division to survive the battle, but ended the battle not with the Crusader tanks that it started out with, but with the American-built M3 light tanks, and I'll explain why in a bit. The 3rd Brigade in 7th Armoured Division was Brigadier Jock Campbell's 7th Support Group. This was the unit Gott had come from, and it was basically a mixed infantry and artillery force. Jock Campbell is actually a very interesting figure who had led a flying column, which was a battle group or camp group equivalent for the period, against the Germans. After his superb leadership of this flying columns were nicknamed Jock Columns, and the name stuck. Basically, These were small, independent, mixed groups which were effective if used correctly in raiding, scouting or harassing missions, but they tended to disperse and dilute British strength during the battles. So there is an argument on whether they were any good or not. Either way, Campbell played a crucial role and an inspirational one during Operation Crusader, which earned him the Victoria Cross. He really became a legendary figure in the Desert War who survived the battle but was killed in a car crash in late February 1942. Campbell's support group consisted of Sidney de Salis' 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, 2nd Battalion the Rifle Brigade, 3rd Anti-Tank Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 60th Field Regiment Royal Artillery, and 1 battery from the 51st Field Regiment Royal Artillery. The 25-pounder artillery that this unit used were the most effective weapons that the British had against the German panzers, and these would get into the thick of the action during Crusader. Also as part of 7th Armoured Division was 11th Hussars Recon Regiment, the 1st King Dragoon Guards Recon Regiment, and the attached 6th South African Armoured Car Regiment from 1st South African Division. All of these were armed with armoured cars, although I'm not certain, but I think they're mostly Humber armoured cars. These were armed with 2-pounder anti-tank guns, like all British armoured fighting vehicles at the time, but were outgunned and out-armoured by the German armoured car equivalents, although they could still take them out. Therefore, 7th Armoured Division was actually a tank-heavy force with only a small amount of infantry in its support group. When you compare this tank-heavy formation to the German panzer divisions, you'll find that the Germans actually have a lot more infantry within their tank formations. And I'll come back to this when we do the Axis units for Crusader. Rommel actually requests not more tanks, but more infantry to support his 2 panzer divisions in North Africa, because he understands that tanks alone cannot win this war, as I've said in previous videos. For those of you looking for proof that British armoured doctrine was not as advanced as the German doctrine, well, here it is, and I'll come back to this later. The next division in 30 Corps was Major General George Brink's 1st South African Division. This was the main infantry element of the corps. Brink had led his division in East Africa under Cunningham and had fought in German East Africa in the First World War. Again, an infantry commander, not a tank man. 1st South African Division had 2 brigades, the first being Brigadier Pienaar's 1st South African Infantry Brigade. Pienaar is a very controversial figure who would lead his brigade in a very unique way during Operation Crusader. Somehow, despite his unusual performance, he would later go on to command 1st South African Division. I'll say no more for now and leave the drama for the main Battlestorm Crusader video. 1st South African Infantry Brigade consisted of 1st Duke of Edinburgh's Rifle Battalion, 1st Royal Natal Carbineers Battalion, 1st Transvaal Scottish Battalion, 4th Battery of the 1st South African Anti-Tank Regiment, and 3rd Company of President Stein's Machine Gun Regiment. Pienaar's 1st South African Brigade would survive Operation Crusader, which isn't surprising considering what Pienaar did. This was unlike Brigadier Bertram Frank Armstrong's 5th South African Infantry Brigade, which was practically wiped out during the operation. This is what prompted Pienaar to act the way he did during the remainder of the battle. Armstrong had First World War experience and had commanded the brigade throughout the East African campaign. He and his staff would be taken prisoner during Crusader, but Armstrong survived the war, which is sad because I couldn't find a photo of him. 5th South African Infantry Brigade consists of 1st South African Irish Battalion, 2nd Botha Battalion and 3rd Transvaal Scottish Battalion. 5th South African Infantry Brigade would not survive Operation Crusader. The remaining units of the division were President Stern Machine Gun Regiment, B Company of the Middellandse Machine Gun Regiment, 1st South African Anti-Aircraft Regiment, 4th Field Artillery Regiment, 7th Field Artillery Regiment and 3rd South African Armoured Car Regiment. Oh, and the whole division is motorised. So these are the 2 divisions in 30 Corps, but there were 2 independent brigades in there as well. The first of which was Brigadier Alexander Gatehouse's 4th Armoured Brigade Group. The reason it gets the name group is because it was 4th Armoured Brigade, plus some extra units on top of that as well. And it was designated the flank support to the 2nd Corps in 8th Army, even though it was part of 30 Corps, which is just confusing. This brigade had 165 of the newly arrived US M3 light tanks. In fact, these were all the M3 tanks that 8th Army fielded in the desert outside of Tobruk. And I'll just point out now that, at least according to the chieftain, the M3s were never nicknamed Stuarts by the US troops or Honeys by the British, so I'm just going to refer to them as M3s from now on. Alexander, or Alec Gatehouse, was a tank officer and was probably the most experienced tank officer the British had in the desert. He had commanded a battalion of tanks in World War I and had been an instructor at Sandhurst and was the commandant of the mechanisation experimental establishment at Farnborough between the years 1933 and 1937. He had a reputation of being a tank specialist, but wasn't really a theorist. He knew how to command tanks and understood that tank warfare was different to cavalry warfare. Now, according to the historian Barnett, who is somewhat biased, because of Gatehouse's experience, his brigade was led in the German style. So basically it used anti-tank guns with the British tanks. Now this could be true, but I have no further evidence to back that up, so just take it with a pinch of salt. 4th Armoured Brigade Group consisted of Lieutenant Colonel Drew's 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars Tank Regiment, 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, 5th Royal Tank Regiment, 2nd Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 102nd Northumberland Hussars Anti-Tank Regiment Royal Horse Artillery, -1 battery, the 2nd Scots Guards Infantry Battalion and 122nd Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. 4th Armoured Brigade would end up giving most of its surviving M3 tanks to 22nd Armoured Brigade and withdrew from the battle in late December. The 2nd Independent Brigade of 30 Corps is Brigadier John Charles Oakes Marriott's 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade. This brigade was ordered to protect the supply dumps of 30 Corps and thus didn't really get involved in the Crusader operation until the final stages of the Axis retreat. It consisted of 9th the Rifle Brigade Battalion, 3rd Coldstream Guards Battalion, 51st Field Artillery Regiment, 12th Battery of the 1st Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, and 1 anti-tank company, but I'm not sure which. So that is Norrie's 30 Corps. Essentially, this is a very tank-heavy force with only 3 infantry brigades, and only 2 of these, the South African Division, really take part in the battle. This means that the main attacking British Corps, according to the plan, doesn't really have a lot of infantry support, which leads to problems. I'll come back to why this happened and why this was a problem towards the end of the video. The 2nd Corps in 8th Army was Lieutenant General Alfred Reed Godwin Austin's 13th Corps. This was the same Godwin Austin who had commanded British forces in Somaliland in 1940, and he's another interesting figure. Overwhelmed by large numbers, he had been forced to evacuate his small force, taking just 260 casualties, but inflicting 2,052 casualties on the Italians. Wavell defended Godwin Austin's evacuation and the loss of East Africa, saying it was the correct thing to do under the circumstances. Churchill was enraged though, saying that the small casualties sustained by the British was evidence that Godwin Austin hadn't put up a fight. This wasn't true though, but Churchill never forgave Godwin Austin for this, and possibly not Wavell either. Godwin Austin would fight successfully in charge of a division in East Africa under Cunningham, and was brought along when Cunningham moved to North Africa. Godwin Austin would survive the battle and the war, but not Churchill's wrath, which would come to haunt him in 1942. 13th Corps had 2 divisions at the time, the first being Major General Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division. Someone once asked me why I always play the New Zealand national anthem when I mention Freyberg. Well, the reason is because this guy wanted all the New Zealander troops to be united under one command, his, rather than be split up across different units like in the Long Range Desert Group. And he later became the 7th Governor General of New Zealand and the first New Zealander to be appointed that position. This is the same Freyberg who was in command of Crete during the battle, ignoring the ultra-intelligence, saying he should be expecting an airborne assault and instead prepared for a naval landing. Freyberg's division would end up playing a crucial and central role during Operation Crusader, but suffers heavy casualties. Freyberg was enraged by the actions of another officer, but I'll wait till the battle video itself before I give you the details. Freyberg and his division sulked back to Egypt in the closing stages of the battle. It would survive, and it would go on to fight in North Africa, Sicily, and then Italy. Freyberg had 3 brigades under his command, and the first was Brigadier Lindsay Inglis's 4th New Zealand Infantry Brigade. This consisted of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Pertz, 18th New Zealand Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Hartnell's 19th Infantry Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kippenberger's 20th New Zealand Infantry Battalion. Kippenberger would go on to edit the New Zealand official history of the Second World War, and while I don't have any of the 51 book series, you can tell it was better edited than the British official history because it at least tells you the names of the unit commanders. Thank you, Playfair, for failing spectacularly at this. The 2nd Brigade of Freyberg's division was Brigadier James Harguest's 5th New Zealand Infantry Brigade. Harguest would be captured during Crusader and apparently refused to salute Rommel. He escaped captivity in 1943 but was killed by artillery in 1944. His brigade consisted of Lieutenant Colonel Harding's 21st New Zealand Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrews' 22nd New Zealand Infantry Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Roman's 23rd New Zealand Infantry Battalion. The final brigade of the 2nd New Zealand Division was Brigadier Barraclough's 6th New Zealand Infantry Brigade. With First World War experience, Barraclough was a lawyer between the wars, becoming a partner in a law firm. After Crusader, Barraclough would command 3rd New Zealand Division in the Pacific Theatre, but was discharged from the military in 1945, eventually becoming Chief Justice of New Zealand and being knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. His brigade consisted of Lieutenant Colonel Claydon Shuttleworth's 24th New Zealand Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Burton's 25th New Zealand Infantry Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Satterthwaite's 26th New Zealand Infantry Battalion. In addition to the 3 infantry brigades, Freyberg's division also had Lieutenant Colonel Williams's 27th New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Dittmer's 28th Maori Battalion, 4th Field Artillery Regiment, 5th Field Artillery Regiment, 6th Field Artillery Regiment, a New Zealand Engineer Battalion, 7th Anti-Tank Regiment, and 14th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. I've decided to use the Maori flag for the Maori Regiment just to give it some distinction, even though the flag itself wasn't designed until 1990. But it's a cool flag. The 2nd Division in 13th Corps was General Frank Messervy's 4th Red Eagle Indian Division. A cavalryman in the Middle East during the First World War, Colonel Messervy had commanded troops in East Africa in 1941, but was soon promoted to Brigadier and commanded 9th Indian Infantry Brigade of 5th Indian Division during the Battle of Keren in early 1941. Having only been Brigadier for just a few weeks, Messervy was then given command of 4th Indian Division. His cavalry background was seen as good enough to put him in charge of 1st Armoured Division at Gazala, but he was soon dismissed and sent to India, where he would be then immediately recalled and put in command of 7th Armoured Division. He was then sacked after failing disastrously as a tank commander. He would then command 7th Indian Division in the Burma campaign, playing a central role there. Messervy's 4th Indian Division has 3 brigades, the first of which was Brigadier Dudley Pasha Russell's 5th Indian Infantry Brigade. This consists of 3 battalions, 1st Battalion the Bus Regiment, 3rd Battalion of the 1st Punjab Regiment, and 4th Battalion of the 6th Rajputana Rifles. Brigadier Dudley Russell, or Pasha as he was called, had fought in the First World War fighting in Palestine. He fought in East Africa in 1941 and helped negotiate the surrender of the Duke of Aosta. Russell would go on to command 8th Indian Division in Iraq and then Italy, and after the war 5th Indian Division as well, before retiring with his American-born wife to the Bahamas. The next brigade in 4th Indian Division is Brigadier Harold Briggs's 7th Indian Infantry Brigade. This consisted of 1st Battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment, 4th Battalion of the 11th Sikh Regiment, and 4th Battalion of the 16th Punjab Regiment. Born in England, Briggs was drafted into the Indian Army in 1914 and fought in Mesopotamia and Palestine. Briggs, or Brigo as he was known, would go on to command the 5th Indian Division at Ghazala, which is why he and his division ended up back in India, having been seen as failures. Briggs would then fight in Burma during the Arakan campaign of 1944 and 45. He later retired to Cyprus, although he gave support to some counter-terrorist operations going on there. The last brigade is Brigadier Andrew Anderson's 11th Indian Infantry Brigade. This consisted of the 1st Battalion of the 6th Rajputana Rifles, 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and 2nd Battalion of the 5th Maratha Light Infantry. Unfortunately, I don't have any information on Anderson at all. The other elements attached to the division were an Indian Engineers Battalion, not sure which, 65th Anti-Tank Regiment, 57th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, 1st Royal Artillery Regiment, 25th Royal Artillery Regiment, 31st Royal Artillery Regiment, Central India Horse Battalion, and 2nd New Zealand Cavalry Regiment, which was a small tank force from Freyberg's division. This last bit is interesting when you consider that Freyberg wanted all New Zealand units to fight together and was complaining over and over again during the planning stages of Crusader for tank support to be given to the infantry element, 13th Corps. Yeah, here was his tank element being taken away from him and given to the 4th Indian Division. It's probably just coincidence, but I'd like to imagine that this was done on purpose. 4th Indian Division had taken part in Operation Compass in 1940-41, so the previous winter, but at the time it had been under the command of Major General Noel Beresford Pierce, who had later gone on to command the whole of the Western Desert Force. So it was a very experienced division, but had a new commander who had been hastily promoted 2 ranks in the previous couple of months. Therefore, would Messervy's 4th Indian Division perform as well during Crusader as it had under Compass? So these are the 2 divisions of 13th Corps, but there were several other units attached to it as well. First was Brigadier Watkins's 1st Army Tank Brigade. This unit was equipped with 132 infantry tanks, which were slower and thicker armoured tanks compared to the faster cruisers. Roughly half of these tanks were Matilda Mark IIs, with the other half being the newer Valentine tanks. The Matildas were heavily armoured and seemingly impervious to Italian artillery, but super slow and were easily defeated by the German 88mm guns. The Valentines were originally designed to be cruiser tanks, so were faster than the Matildas, but slower than normal cruisers, and not as heavily armoured as Matildas either. So Valentines ended up not really being suited to either the infantry nor cruiser roles. Either way, Watkins's brigade would support the infantry as they advanced on Axis forces along the coast. 1st Army Tank Brigade consisted of 8th Royal Tank Regiment, armed with both Matildas and Valentines, 42nd Royal Tank Regiment armed entirely with Matildas, and 44th Royal Tank Regiment armed with both Matildas and Valentines. The other units attached to 13th Corps were 7th Medium Artillery Regiment, 8th Medium Artillery Regiment, 64th Medium Artillery Regiment, 86th Medium Artillery Regiment, 65th Norfolk Yeomanry Anti-Tank Regiment, and 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment. 13th Corps would play a vital role in the Crusader battle, and without this corps, it's doubtful victory would have been achieved at all. So these were the 2 corps of 8th Army, but there were also several other units that took part in Crusader. The first was Major General Ronald Mackenzie Scobie's 70th Infantry Division, which was actually the Tobruk garrison. It had replaced most of Moorhead's 9th Australian Division, although some of that division was actually still in Tobruk at the time. Scobie was the son of an Indian civil servant and fought with the Royal Engineers from 1914, getting wounded twice in the First World War. He was actually Deputy Director of Mobilisation at the War Office when the war broke out. Scobie ended up as British commander in Greece in September 1944, where he played an active role in the pre-Greek Civil War era, although it really was the beginning of the Civil War in Greece itself. At Tobruk, Scobie expected Rommel to attack, and indeed Rommel was planning to attack Tobruk on the 20th of November. But Scobie was also ordered to plan to break out during Crusader, which began on the 18th of November. If all went well, he would join with advancing British forces from Egypt. Scobie's division consisted of 3 brigades, the first of which was Brigadier Chappell's 14th Infantry Brigade. Chappell had 3 battalions, the 1st Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Battalion, 2nd Black Watch Battalion, and 2nd York and Lancaster Battalion. He also had the 2nd Company of 15th Australian Battalion, which hadn't been evacuated from Tobruk along with the rest of the 9th Australian Division. Chappell also had 1 company from the 56th Anti-Tank Regiment, but I'm not sure which one it was. The 2nd Brigade was Brigadier Lomax's 16th Infantry Brigade. Lomax would go on to command the 26th Indian Infantry Division and briefly the 14th Indian Infantry Division as well, fighting around Arakan against the Japanese. His brigade at Tobruk consisted of the 2nd King's Own Battalion, 2nd Leicestershire Battalion and 4th Queen's Royal Battalion, a portion of the 1st Royal Northumberland Fusiliers Battalion, which I assume means company, and 1 company from the 56th Anti-Tank Regiment, but again, I don't know which one. The final brigade of Scobie's division was Brigadier Cox's 23rd Infantry Brigade. This consisted of the 1st Durham Light Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Nichols's 1st Essex Battalion, 4th Border Battalion, a portion of the 1st Northumberland Fusiliers Battalion, again probably a company, 2nd Company of the 13th Australian Infantry Battalion, which again hadn't been evacuated either, and a company from the 56th Anti-Tank Regiment. And the other units of Scobie's division were 1 Royal Engineer Battalion, of unknown designation, 144th Field Artillery Regiment, 1st Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 104th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 107th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment, 69th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, and the King's Dragoon Guards Recon Regiment. But Scobie wasn't just a divisional commander. He was also the commander of the whole of the Tobruk garrison. So he had his division to command, but he also had 2 attached brigades as well, which didn't fit into his division, but he was still in command of them. The first was Major General Stanislaw Kopanski's Polish 1st Carpathian Brigade. This has 6,116 men, but they weren't all Polish, as you're about to find out. Kopanski would rise to command the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division and eventually become Chief of Staff of the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces in the West. After the war, Polish forces were redesignated the Polish Resettlement Corps, and Kopanski had to find work and homes for the Polish veterans he had unwilling to go back to communist-occupied Poland. He himself remained as part of the Polish government in exile until he died in 1976. His brigade consisted of the 1st Carpathian Battalion, 2nd Carpathian Battalion, 3rd Carpathian Battalion, Carpathian Machine Gun Battalion, Carpathian Field Artillery Regiment, Carpathian Anti-Tank Regiment, Carpathian Engineer Company, and the 11th Czech Infantry Battalion. Yeah, a Czech battalion. British forces really were an international force with Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Poles, Czechs, South Africans, and this isn't including the British themselves, which had English, Scots, Welsh, Irish, as well as elements from all over the empire. And we've seen already the Free French forces fighting with the British in previous battles in the North African campaign, although not as part of Operation Crusader, but this really was a crusade of multiple different nationalities. I don't know why, but I just wanted to point this out because I just find this really interesting how all of these people could work together for a common cause. The other brigade Scobie had attached was Brigadier Williamson's 32nd Tank Brigade. This had 32 cruisers, 25 M3s and 69 Matildas at the start of the battle. It consisted of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment equipped with the old A-10 cruisers, Lieutenant Colonel Walter O'Carroll's 4th Royal Tank Regiment armed with Matildas, and D Squadron of 7th Royal Tank Regiment with 3 Matildas. This then is Scobie's Tobruk garrison. As part of 8th Army there was also Brigadier Reed's Oasis Force, which was a diversionary force designed to strike into the desert flank through JLO towards the coast. It was under the command of Brigadier Reed, who was in charge of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade Group. This consisted of 1st Worcestershire Battalion, 6th Company of the 13th Frontier Force Battalion, 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Punjab Regiment, 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, 60th Field Artillery Regiment, 7th Medium Artillery Regiment, C Battery of 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment, 1st Light Anti-Air Regiment, 6th Anti-Air Regiment, Brigadier Cooper's 6th South African Armoured Car Regiment, and 7th South African Recce Regiment. A Scotsman who had fought in the First World War, Reed had moved to the Indian Army between the wars and had fought in East Africa. After being captured in 1942, he escaped Italian prison in 1943 and became commander of 10th Indian Division, and was actually wounded in combat in 1944. His brigade group would try and distract Rommel's attention from the main action to the north, but ultimately would fail to do so. 8th Army also had the 2nd South African Division in reserve, commanded by Major General Villiers. This consisted of 3 brigades. The first was Brigadier Borain's 3rd South African Infantry Brigade. This had the 1st Imperial Light Horse Battalion, the 1st Royal Durban Light Infantry Battalion, and the 1st Rand Light Infantry Battalion as part of the brigade. Borain would be blown up in a minefield in January 1942. But by some miracle, he was saved by the medics and spent the rest of his life in and out of hospital due to his injuries. The next was Brigadier Hayton's 4th South African Infantry Brigade with the Umvoti Mounted Rifles Battalion, 2nd Royal Durban Light Infantry Battalion, and the Kaffrarian Rifles Battalion. The final brigade was Brigadier Cooper's 6th South African Infantry Brigade. This consisted of the 2nd Transvaal Scottish Battalion, 1st South African Police Battalion, and the 2nd South African Police Battalion as well. The other units of 2nd Division were D Midlander Machine Gun Regiment, a unit of South African Engineers, 2nd South African Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, 1st Field Artillery Regiment, 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, 5th Field Artillery Regiment, 2nd South African Anti-Tank Regiment, and 7th South African Armoured Recce Regiment. This division would take Bardia during Crusader, but would be trapped and mostly wiped out when Tobruk fell in 1942 and was thus disbanded. There were a few more units as part of the 8th Army's initial order of battle. These were the Long Range Desert Group, a small but successful raiding force, 10th New Zealand Railway Construction Company, 13th New Zealand Railway Construction Company, and the 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment. There were also more units arriving in early December as reinforcements. Elements of Lumsden's 1st Armoured Division, including 12th Lancers Regiment with armoured cars, and the 2nd Armoured Brigade with 60 M3s and 106 Crusader tanks. The Royal Dragoons with armoured cars, 38th Indian Infantry Brigade, 150th Infantry Brigade, and 50th Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion, all arriving in early December. Reinforcements arriving in mid-December, mostly to take out Bardia and other Axis frontier garrisons, included the New Zealand Divisional Cavalry Regiment, equipped with light tanks and Bren carriers, the 67th Medium Royal Artillery Regiment, the 68th Medium Royal Artillery Regiment, 211th Medium Royal Artillery Battery, the 7th South African Field Royal Artillery Regiment, and 1st Carpathian Field Artillery Regiment. And so this is the British Crusader order of battle. Note though that there's a definite split between the tank and infantry elements, with barely any infantry in with 30 Corps. This would have a massive impact on the battle, resulting in heavy tank losses for the British. And you might be asking yourself, why did the British split their tanks from their infantry? Why would they handicap themselves like this? Well, it was because British armoured warfare doctrine between the wars hadn't been fleshed out. The main proponent of British armoured warfare doctrine was Major General Sir Percy Hobart, the guy whose writings inspired Heinz Guderian, and the same Hobart who would later go on to create the Funnies tanks. Hobart had actually created 7th Armoured Division. It was his brainchild. But Hobart was an eccentric character who believed that tanks could win battles all by themselves. Well, with British doctrine split between the infantry, cavalry and the emerging armoured forces, it seems Hobart was trying to show that tanks were important on the modern battlefield and that they didn't need any other support. But what this meant was that when Cunningham arrived and started to organise his forces for Operation Crusader, not having any tank background, he looked to Hobart for advice. So with Hobart's ideas, Cunningham decided to split his force into 2 corps, one with mostly infantry and one with mostly tanks. This causes so many issues during the battle, as well as in the planning stages, and it's because the British as a whole had neglected tank warfare in the interwar period and hadn't hammered out a sufficient combined arms doctrine. And now they were having to do this while fighting the Germans, specifically Rommel, armed with panzer divisions which had large infantry elements as part of them. There are many reasons for this neglecting doctrine. Just to list a few, you have the inter-service rivalries between the infantry, artillery, cavalry and tank units. You have a regiment system that reduced innovation. You also have an officer corps dominated by the upper classes who favoured cavalry, at least up until Blitzkrieg proved itself. But the point is this. The British were going into Operation Crusader with a lopsided force, similar in some ways to the Soviet tank-heavy mechanised corps at the Battle of Dubno in 1941, the biggest tank battle of the war. Considering that Crusader was designed to be fought as a purely tank versus tank engagement with an infantry follow-up, the whole plan was based on a flawed and immature concept that tanks could and should engage enemy tanks alone, as the Germans and Rommel had already learned. This was not the purpose of tanks. Tanks on their own, with little infantry support, is a bad idea. And the British were going into Crusader with a serious flaw in their order of battle, as you will find out in the main Battlestorm Operation Crusader video coming soon. Over the next few weeks I'm going to be concentrating on videos related to Operation Crusader. I must have somewhere in the region of 30 or 40 books on this topic now, and it's all thanks to the support of my Patreons who've allowed me to amass them. In 2 weeks' time we'll take a look at the Axis order of battle for Crusader, after I've done a much needed video on Kampfgruppen next week. Crusader will probably be the biggest Battlestorm documentary I've made so far, and it will be full of nitty-gritty details. These details come from the books, and I need more of these books for all the battles I'm going to be covering in the future. Please consider supporting me on Patreon and make these videos as good as they can be. You'll find the link to my Patreon page in the video description and the sources I've used for this video in the pinned comment in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Thank you for supporting. Bye for now.